In Racing Through Time, we look at the drivers, the teams, the races and the circuits that made motorsport history. Sir Stirling Moss is known as the best racing driver never to win the World Championship. What that obscures is his mastery of all types of racing and rallying, and that he was the first racing professional whose job was purely driving. Stirling Moss always presented himself as a motorsport professional and lives up to that image to this day. His name is synonymous worldwide with motor racing, and he's regarded as the epitome of a racing driver. In this candid look at his career, Stirling talks about the cars, the drivers, and the great races in which he took part. It's just not possible to cover every race or every car he drove, but these are the classic moments in his career. From his earliest racing days, Stirling had a manager, Ken Gregory, to maximise his racing and commercial opportunities. Stirling Moss was the complete racing package. However, all the talk means nothing if you can't back it up with performances to match. Stirling is rated by many as the world's most versatile driver. Grand Prix, sports cars, touring cars, road racing epics, rallying and land speed record attempts have all formed part of Stirling's diverse racing CV. He was the prototype for the modern Grand Prix driver in terms of his presentation and commercial acumen. In turn, he was able to take motor racing to a wider audience wherever he competed. In contrast to today's isolated drivers, he's personable and available for public appearances and enjoys his role in the world of motorsport. What was his family background and how did his career start?
I suppose because I was brought up with fast cars, not racing cars, although I had seen a racing car at Brooklands. My father took me to Brooklands when I was a kid. But I've been brought up with quick cars. I mean, my father had 2.3 Alfa, I think it was. And I enjoyed being with them, not driving them, because I hadn't driven them. And horses, I did horses really to please my mother. It wasn't something that I really liked that much. I mean, I enjoyed it to an extent, but then when my sister got old enough, and she turned out, thank goodness, to be very good, I was allowed to get off the hook. And so I started to drive when I was very late 15, because I got a predated license by mistake from the MOT, I suppose. And I enjoyed driving. So I didn't meet with much help from my family until later on, once I got into it. Then my father was an enormous help. He backed me right to the hilt, helped me in every way he could, helped me strip the engine down when it was a Jap and grind the valves in and do all those things. So it went really from very negative and against it, because I suppose he thought it was a whim. You know, as a kid you say, well, I want to be whatever. And once he realised that I was interested and really meant it and dedicated to it, then he fell in right behind me, as in fact did my mother. When I started, remember, there were no races. We were all hill climbs because we didn't have races, and so I entered in places like Shelsley Walsh and Stanmer Park and Booley Bay and so on. Then after that, John Heath had seen me drive, and he was quite sufficiently impressed that he came to me and said, "Look, would you drive for my team?" Which was really a Formula 2 team of HWMs. And I asked him what it entailed, and he said, well, it entails going around Europe racing at these various races, and I thought it sounded fantastic. And it really was, I mean, a wonderful life that nobody could duplicate now. I mean, it just couldn't happen now. The whole world's changed too much, and the world of motor racing as well. So I joined John Heath at a very tender age of sort of 18, 19 years old, and then went abroad. And I think it was probably then when I could see the enormous pleasure. It was my sport anyway. I enjoyed the exhilaration of driving, but to be able to have the pleasure of going from one race to another and having these fantastic circuits. I mean, they're all road circuits. They weren't race tracks as we know them. There were one or two, I mean, Goodwood and so on, but basically they were on the roads. And when I say roads, I mean, of course, closed circuits around a place like Aix-les-Bains. They'd close off 3 or 4 miles of the town, or 1.5 miles, depending where it was, like Monaco. And the life was a fantastic life, really. I mean, we'd travel, all around Europe in a car, go to, like a circus, we'd go from, say, Mete or somewhere down to Bari in southern Italy. We'd drive down there with John Heath in his car, stopping on the way at cheap places, but very nice, and get down there and be reasonably fated, as you can imagine, because this was their big race for the area. Even if it was only a small race, it was still a big deal for the area we're in. And then they'd have, party for the drivers, and then we had the fantastic fun of racing. 2 days practice, usually early in the morning, before the town sort of got going, or the market, whatever. The roads would be closed with straw bales. And then, of course, the race on Sunday. And then Sunday night, there'd be a big do we had to go to pick up our start money. If you didn't go, you didn't get your money, which was fair enough. And then the next day, on the Monday, we'd probably mosey off and say, okay, we'll see the mechanics, usually Al Francis and co., Tony Robinson and people, and say, well, we'll see you next weekend at wherever it was we were going to, maybe back up north or maybe keep down south. And it was just a wonderful life.
In these continental races, the Formula 2 HWM was no match for the Ferraris.
The other day I was driving along the road with my wife, and a car came past us pretty quickly. And I remember thinking, my God, that's what Ferraris used to do. When you're in an HWM flogging along 136 miles an hour, and a Ferrari go past at 152, it wasn't half quick. I mean, I'd swing out like as fast as I could to try and get in the slipstream and wouldn't get it. I mean, however quickly, even if I nearly hit him going, but they were that much quicker. I mean, the HWMs were the best we could field, and they were pretty good. But I mean, compared with the Ferrari or even the Gordini, I mean, the Gordini was not as fast as the Ferrari, but very nimble. But it only came back to me the other day, because you see such competitive cars now that is relatively equal. In those days, that didn't happen.
Stirling's break into a professional team came via a sports car race with a privately entered Jaguar XK120 in the Tourist Trophy.
That came about because a chap called Tommy Wisdom, who was the motoring correspondent of the Daily Herald, as it was, had seen me race. He said, look, Stirling, I've got an XK120 which you couldn't buy. I mean, they were like hen's teeth. He said, I've got one of these. I'm getting one because I'm impressed, and they're letting me buy one, Bill Lance. He said, but I've got a giant Jupiter I think I'm racing in the Tourist Trophy. Would you like to drive my Jag? And I said, what's the deal? He said, well, look, we'll go 50-50 right away. Half and half. And I thought, fantastic. I mean, at that time, nobody like Jaguar or Aston Martin or even MG, or nobody would let me have a car for the race, because I think they all thought perhaps I was going a bit quickly, and if I was going to have a shunt, they didn't want me to do it in their car. And Jag certainly wouldn't. And then when Tommy offered me this car, it was fantastic. And of course I was lucky enough to win it and get the fastest lap and so on in pouring weather, appalling weather, which again was in those days it didn't matter so much. I mean, we were on the racing tyres at the time, which of course were good in wet or dry, and the car was probably as good as anybody else's. I mean, Jaguar sort of prepared it for him, although it was privately owned. And the fact that I managed to beat the factory team and all the other ones, of course, was tremendous help to me, because that night Bill Lowndes, or Sir William as he later was known, came up to me and said, would I lead his team the following year, which of course was an enormous step forward for me, because although it wasn't Formula racing, it was one of the most prestigious teams, and to go and lead them was, I mean, I just can't tell you what it was, a birthday present. It was fantastic.
For the early part of his career, Stirling was resolutely patriotic, choosing to race only British cars. After a falling out with Enzo Ferrari, he stayed with cars from the UK. That meant he did miss opportunities, while Mike Hawthorn joined Ferrari and had international success earlier in his career than Stirling.
So I wanted to drive British cars. I mean, I'm British, I prefer British cars, and all the time they were available, I drove for them. I mean, at that time, of course, Vanwall hadn't arrived. And up till that point, we'd had the HWMs, and then they faded out, and then Leslie Johnson brought out the E-Type, which was a flop, and then I thought, well, what can I do? I'll try and get a Cooper, and I made a lot of not too smart choices, if you like. Not all options were open to me. But I wanted to drive British because I speak the language. I couldn't at that time speak much French. I couldn't speak Italian or German. And anyway, I'm English. And the green cars are what I wanted to drive. So that is why I did persevere with them until it was impossible not to to go foreign. And in fact, I bought the 250F, or at least I didn't. My father and manager again bought it when I was absent.
The Maserati 250F meant Stirling could compete with the top drivers in 1954.
The first I knew about that was I was on a boat coming back from America, and on the radio phones they were saying down there, you bought a 250F Mazda. And I was sort of saying, what? And they're saying 250. And then my mind, I can remember very well, my mind raced and thought, God, now I've got a car that can win. How the hell is it going to be? It's a lot easier to be the underdog and do well. If people expect you to be 6th or 7th and you happen to be 4th, that looks terrific. If you have a car that can win and you don't, that looks pretty bad.
The plan was to secure a drive with Mercedes, who was soon to return to Grand Prix racing.
My father and manager went to Neubau without my knowing and said, will you take Stirling next year? This was in 53, when they heard that the Mercedes were coming out in 54. And Neubau said to them, he hasn't had sufficient experience in a potential winning car, and he's done very well with his HWMs and those things, but he hasn't driven a really potential winner. He ought to get a car where he can show how well he can do when he's got a car that might win. And that was actually what made me buy the 250F. At the beginning of the year I bought the car, and then the factory thought I was going fairly well and offered me theirs, which is quite an interesting story in itself. When I bought the car, it was you do 7,702 with a maximum revs. We had an agreement with Maserati that as things were developed, I would get them. And I'm going down the straight, at Monza or somewhere. No, earlier than Monza, I think. And John Berry, a factory manager, came round past me, and I said, what have you got to his car? They said, well, he's got bigger valves. I said, well, why haven't I got them? He said, well, they said to me, well, we wouldn't want to give them to you until they're tried and tested, you see. So well, I was always one behind. This was before I joined the factory. I was always one behind, although they were nice people. So then when they came to me later in that year, that must have been a very early race, and said, look, would you like to drive a factory car? I said, certainly. And when I got in the factory car, then the rev limit went straight up from 772 up to 8,000. Same sort of car, because they were rebuilding it at the time. And it made a very big difference, obviously, but we did get a lot of mechanical failures, and in that particular race, I think it was an oil tank probably cracked or something. I mean, I don't know why it did. I mean, it didn't hit anything. And of course, that was it. And I was out. It was obviously a great tragedy in front of the Italians. I mean, to drive an Italian car and win in Italy, I mean, really is the thing to do, I can tell you. Maserati have never been quite as, the Italians never quite as fired up about Mazda as they are Ferrari, but having said that, they're still Italians. They still like to see somebody trying and having a go, and it was unfortunate.
Having driven for everyone from small privateers up to the superbly resourced Mercedes-Benz, Stirling is in a unique position to compare racing teams of the era.
Teams fall into two categories. You've got the very best, which of course were Mercedes. There's no comparison. I mean, when you've got a man like Neubauer, people like Ulrich Haltenson, the way it would run, the way that they would come up and ask you what you wanted, and I mean, I always had the feeling with Mercs, if you asked for it, they'd fit it the next day, or if I said, look, I want square wheels, they'd say, well, we fitted them 25 years ago and they didn't work. Or the next day they'd be fitted, you know. I mean, they were an incredible company. And that's the only one I ever drove for, of that type. Now, after that, then you start talking about people like John Wire, who was a great tactician and one of the great team managers as well. But the team wasn't quite able to do the same as Mercedes. I mean, Aston Martin was not Daimler-Benz.
What about the drivers he raced against?
I've always believed Fangio was the greatest driver that has ever been. I still think that. I think there've been quite a few people that come very close. Being close and being on the top are two different things. I think Jimmy Clark, for instance, was a fantastic driver. I didn't see that much of Jimmy because he really was ascending when I got out, and there've been a lot of other people since. But I think I can best explain the difference between Fangio and Ascari was very, very small. I mean, you're not talking of a big difference. But I remember my car, I think, had broken at Bari or somewhere like that, and I was watching the cars, and Ascari would come round and he'd just touch the straw bale, just nudge it, and every time he'd do the same thing. Fantastic. Fangio would come past and he wouldn't quite touch; he'd just touch the whiskers, and still he was just as quick. And I thought the precision of the man, the balance of the car, and the tenacity and the way he keep going at the same speed for so long, like a water dripping, was I think a lot of his strength, and he was very composed, a nice driver to watch, as of course was Farina, but Farina was a much harder driver. I don't mean necessarily harder on the car, but much tougher to drive against. Fangio was a gentleman. I don't mean he'd say take the corner or anything like that, but whatever he did was extremely ethical. Now, Nino Farina wasn't quite as easy as that. I mean, he was a bit rougher. And Ascari, no, much more than the Fangio mould, but and nice person. But I think just that whisker away from being with Fangio and the odd fifth here and there, it makes a difference. And I think that's what tells the difference between one driver and another.
What have been the major changes for drivers from the 1950s to the aerodynamic downforce era that emerged in the 1970s?
Of course, in modern days, I think it's closed up a lot because of the enormous adhesion of the tyre. I think that because you've now got lateral G up to 3 or 4, in my day it was probably around 0.8 or 9, I think when it's much lower, the driver has much more input, if you like, than he's able to show now. Not because he was greater necessarily then, but I think that the picture he could paint was much freer for him. It's a totally different sport. I mean, I can remember the time when brakes were so bad that if you put the brakes on really hard, you had to wait until they cooled off. I mean, seriously, it was really quite a big bad thing with drum brakes, even the better ones. And then we used to get things like fading dampers, so that the damping wasn't as good, and so the car's road holding would go off, and you had to contour the tyres down, and all sorts of different things we had to face, which of course they don't face now. They have a lot of other problems. So although the sport is different, what you're trying to do is the same thing. You're trying to take a car that is designed to do something and make it do more than I won't say more than it's designed to do, but more than one would expect it to do. You are driving on the limit, and motor racing is 10/10ths. And to do 10/10ths in any year is exactly the same as any other year, except the ground rules have changed a bit, but it's still the same thing.
Stirling made it his job to learn as much as he possibly could from Fangio.
We were known as the train. The press called it the train because Fangio and I go, I suppose, a couple of metres apart. And Neubauer, I remember once coming up to me and saying, if you follow Fangio, I don't like it, you want to be further away. I said, well, it's much easier to follow him closer, you can see what he's doing. He said, well, what happens if Fangio has a shunt? You'll be with him. I said, well, Fangio doesn't shunt. And really, I mean, that was my thing. I mean, he was that good. But having said that, at Zandvoort, of course, where there was a lot of sand in those days, following Fangio that closely, I think it would have happened even if I'd been 5 yards back, but my engine was completely destroyed. There's so much sand had gone in that all the tolerances and everything were worn out. So, and of course in those days it didn't change quite as much as they do in modern times. I mean, now an engine, when the race is over, it's out. In those days, obviously we'd do certain things to it, check it, but it would be used quite often. The 55 Grand Prix in England, the British Grand Prix, I won it. I don't know now whether I actually beat him or whether he sort of eased off and let me win. I don't know. Fangio is the sort of man who thought, well, it's his home thing, better for Mercedes, better for him, that he would do that. So I just don't know. And if I ask him, he won't really tell me. So of course not. He said, you were really on form that day. It was your race.
How did Stirling rate Fangio's driving in sports cars?
I don't say he disliked sports cars, but I don't think Fangio liked them as much as I did. He didn't like the streamlined racing car as much as I did. I mean, to me, whether it's streamlined or isn't didn't really matter. To Fangio, for some reason, it did make more difference. And there's no doubt that in sports cars, I had a lot of success, the Targa and so on. And yes, I think in sports cars I could beat him. But that isn't the same thing. The ultimate of racing is Formula One, and I think he was the best. The Targa Florio, I think, is a great event because I did actually learn the circuit and I raced it. The Mille Miglia, I did not learn the circuit. I had this fantastic guide dog, Dennis Jenkinson, showing me around, and I interpreted his hand signals to the best of my ability. But I wasn't really on that one. I didn't drive meaning to be on 9/10ths. Maybe I was at 9 to 9 or to 10/10ths occasionally because I did something I wasn't expecting. But I did actually race the Targa at 9/10ths, which is about as fast as I'd like to race. Occasionally one nudges up a bit 8 or 9 tenths is pretty quick. And learning the Targa circuit, 50 odd miles round, to me was made it a fantastic race because it was short enough I could learn it. I think that because Fangio was still there was always somebody that one was trying to look up to, and somebody that one was trying to always equal, or obviously hopefully better. I mean, I remember going to Monaco with Fangio, and he went out and posted a particular time with a Merc, and I went out and beat it. And I'm sort of taking my helmet off, and he jumps in his car, goes out and beats it again. I thought, well, I'll have a go at that, and went out and I managed to beat him. And it was just going on little increments. But by the end, when Neubauer said, look, that's enough, Fangio regained the lead. But at that time, I suppose. No, I don't know that I ever felt that I was the second best. I don't know. I think it's some races I'd drive, I would feel that really I'd done a good race. Yes, there are times when I have actually completed the race, I thought, well, boy, you did a damn good job there. Other times I thought, well, you managed to scratch in second, but really and truly you didn't drive as well as you might have done to get it. It's particularly when you're driving for Mercedes. It's the one advantage you have with Mercedes. Or at my time, once you got in that silver car, nobody was trying to beat you. They were trying to be the first non-Mercedes home, which of course is entirely against the way I like to think. I think that if the silver cars there, they're the ones you got to try and beat. But very few people felt that. I mean, it was a very great benefit to be with the Silver Star, because it gave you an automatic great advantage over the other drivers. Monaco again is a race circuit that particularly suits my style. Far more than the fast ones. I mean, I always look upon myself as more of a slow circuit driver than the fast circuit driver, because again, if you're going to go down the Master Straight through the kink at 155 miles an hour in the wet, it's a bit like this. If on the other hand, a little bit nerve-wracking, but going along and round whatever it is, around the casino at Monaco at considerably less speed, it's still nerve-wracking if you get it wrong. Of course it is, but it is not quite as, I don't know, I found it more easy to cope with the slower circuits than the really fast ones, I guess.
What was Stirling's racing technique?
I found a Grand Prix car needs to be driven with great accuracy. A Grand Prix car was more responsive, yes, than a sports car. I mean, for instance, driving the Formula One Merc, the 196, was considerably easier than driving the 300 SLR, which was quite a difficult car because it was a very large car, nothing like as easy as, say, as a Mazda or an Aston. But that was a characteristic of the vehicle as against being the type, whether it's sports or Formula. Formula cars, I enjoyed sports cars because I think that probably the reason was that in Formula One, Fangio, I think, was the best there was, and there were quite a few other people who were pretty quick, and one had to really get moving to beat people like Jean Bert and so on. In sports cars, I didn't have so much difficulty. I found it was easier to be a little bit quicker than the people that maybe in Formula One I wasn't. You see, so I think that's why I probably enjoyed sports cars as much as Formula One, because there's no doubt that winning race is more fun than driving in it. I mean, half the fun of racing is racing, the other half is winning, and one has to accept that.
Moss was especially skilled on wet tracks.
I think the reason I liked the wet, 2 or 3 reasons. One is others didn't like it, and automatically if others don't like it and you like it, dislike it less than they do, you're at an advantage, there's no two ways about it. So I would commercialise on that. Secondly, I am a driver who is, I would say, who takes the narrow line, whereas somebody like Graham Hill would take the wide line. It's just a different characteristic. Jack Brabham would take a narrow line, but he would be a type of driver who would come in and slide. I'm a driver who goes into a corner earlier maybe than some. I brake later than many, but I use my braking to position the motor car. Now, when you're in the wet, obviously you can do the same thing, but anything that you do is inclined to be exaggerated, because your lateral G, your coefficient of friction, has dropped, and therefore things that you do are inclined to be exaggerated one way or the other. In other words, you turn the steering too much, it's going to negate, the steering is going to understeer very badly, or you're not going to get any front-end collision. Well, that happens earlier and differently in the wet. Same with the back end is going to break away, it'll do it more in the wet than it will in the dry. So it's a case of still balancing the thing up, and I think it's that my style, my technique, I suppose, happened to suit the wet, probably by lack of judgment, maybe more than other techniques did. But certainly the wet normally. The worst thing about driving the wet is if you couldn't see properly. That's one of the worst things. Is the spray from cars in front. It's very frightening to drive down the straight and not know even the colour of the car in front, and that's the way it was.
How did Stirling's rivals approach their racing?
In my era, Pete Collins, Mike Hawthorne, my early, all the Musso and Castellotti, I don't think really, other than maybe people like Taruffi, Paul Frere, who really had analytical minds, I think the other drivers would just go into a corner and drive fast and say, come on, let's get in there. I think there was a lot of that, and it interested me to analyse why it was quicker to do this or that, and I was never very brave as a driver. In fact, I think I'm right in saying I don't think I spun until I'd been racing for 4 years, and when I did spin, it was because I got on some loose stuff, and it frightened the hell out of me, and so I always like to leave myself a certain cushion. The modern thing of put your welly in there certainly wasn't around for me. I'll tell you that. I mean, I frankly was too scared. I mean, I'd drive as fast as I felt was fast enough, and I wouldn't be pulled past it. Although I had a lot of accidents. I mean, I had 6 or 7 wheels come off, and I had 7 or 8 brake failures, and twice the steering sheared. Those weren't my fault. I had wishbones break and all sorts of stuff. But of the things, I never reckoned to drive faster than I felt happy.
While Stirling was the arch professional, he did enjoy his work.
I didn't look upon it as work. I looked upon it as fun. And I mean, if you enjoy eating, you eat. If you enjoy racing, you race. And if somebody would call me up and say, "Listen, I've got a Fraser Nash. I wanted you to drive in whatever it was," I'd say, "My gosh, that's great. Can I fit it in?" And if I could fit it in, and we could work reasonable terms on it, then I'd do it. Oh, certainly. I mean, the reason I was racing that much was because I loved the racing. I mean, the money we made from driving, or in fact winning, was pretty small. I mean. In those days, when the early days, I mean, you might get £50 for winning, or 25 maybe. So, I mean, the money was obviously, it was nice, it was a perk. But basically, I drove a lot of cars because I just enjoyed driving the Mark 7 Jag and the XK120 and the 500 and, anything that people would come up with.
Stirling returned to British cars in 1957 with the emergence of Vanwall.
The Vanwall was an enormous step for the whole of all of motor racing for England. I mean, let's face it, to have an English car that could go and do so well. And I mean, I think we won the World Championship with it that year. And I mean, it was not an easy car to drive. Having said that, it was not easy. But Tony van der Velde was a very tough man, and he built this car. And he got good people. He got Frank Costa. He brought in Chapman, who did the rear end and so on. It had an awful gearbox, and it was not an easy car to drive by any means, but it was quick, and we were winning with it. So, and it was English, and that was a big thing as far as I was concerned. But I mean, he did have a pretty good team of drivers. I mean, Stuart Lewis Evans was a very fast driver, very fast. And Tony Brooks, of course, in my mind, was the greatest driver that I've ever driven against, who very few people knew. I mean, if I had to pick out people to make my own team of all time, I reckon that it wouldn't be a very big team before Tony Brooks would be in there. I mean, he was an amazingly good driver, tremendously good. And we had a good year. But having said that, it was not as nice to drive as say, the Mazda. 250F was a much nicer car to drive than the Vanwall, but it wouldn't beat it. We had a very bad flat spot, which got better as we turned from alcohol, of course, onto petrol, and the flat spot did go away, but it was much better. But it was not an easy car. But you see, in those days, again, cars, the Aston Martin had a very, very narrow rev range, and so times were different.
Stirling was again close to winning the World Championship in 1958.
Mike won the title. He didn't win many races. I won a lot more races, but didn't win the title. When we entered the last race, I mean, I had to win the race, get fastest lap, and Mike Hawthorne not be second. And right up until the very end, Mike Hawthorn wasn't second. I did have the fastest lap. I did win the race. And then, correctly, Phil Hill backed off and let Mike go through to get second place and, of course, take the championship. I often wonder whether that would happen today. I rather doubt it. I don't think there is that much understanding or comradeship or love of the sport, because to me that was the correct thing to do. It was the sporting thing to do. And motor racing was, in my era, was very much a sport, and one tried to do the correct things by what the sport stood for. I mean, Mike Hawthorn, I remember once they tried to disqualify him at a race in Portugal, and because he'd gone up the escape road and pushed the car or something. And obviously I gave evidence for him that he wasn't going the wrong way of the circuit because he was up the escape road. Well, to me that was the right thing to do. I mean, he wasn't cheating, he hadn't done any contravention of rules, and they did let it stand in the end, and of course I lost my title on that as well. But that doesn't in any way upset me, because I really believe that that's what the sport should be about. It wasn't a business then, although I made my living at it. It wasn't a business. It was a sport at which few of us managed to live well from it.
At the beginning of 1958, Stirling won a Grand Prix in an entirely different car. The race was the Argentinian Grand Prix. The car was a Cooper. When did he realise that rear-engined cars were the way ahead?
I suppose about that era, I must have realised that the nimbleness and the manoeuvrability of the rear-engine car, the balance and the way that you can utilise what it offers, and the way that you can extend the car, all those things are a lot easier with a rear-engine car. There are some exceptions. I think the P25 Vanwall probably is one of the better front-engine cars with which you could use the car to your benefit very much. I think that's one of the few cars that would probably compete with the rear-engine Cooper for its nimbleness. But seeing that once the thing swings towards rear-engine, then of course everybody does, and they stop developing their front engines, and therefore obviously even if other front-engine cars could have been developed that would have been better and nicer than the P25 BRM, the need was not there because they went on rear-engine.
While Stirling was very much a public figure, the rapport with team members and mechanics remained vital.
Racing isn't just driving the car. That is, of course, that is the heart of the matter. The main artery is getting out there and driving the car. Then you're on your own. It's you. But when you're out there, when you're on your own, that's only a very small portion of the week. And to be with people that you enjoy, to be with mechanics who you know that you're taking something they've made and created, and you're going around as a showman and you're as a salesman actually, and sort of showing what they've done, and you are the person who's putting over the stuff. And that's what a driver's doing. And I was taking this car that Alf and his crowd have done, and Rob Walker put the money out to do it. And to me, to go with such a small outfit, a little road show like that, and go out and try and beat the others was most rewarding.
Tony Robinson was the chief mechanic with the Moss family racing team, British Racing Partnership. He was able to assess Stirling close up. Was he a car breaker?
Well, I don't think he was a car breaker, not during the period that I was working for him. I think quite the reverse. I think he's had a good feeling for a car. He may have given the impression he was a car breaker, and that's probably because he was driving much faster than the other drivers who were around at that time. He had the natural ability to throw a car around quick. Certainly didn't have to tiger himself to get a quick time. To a lot of people it certainly gave the impression he could have been a car breaker, but quite frankly when the car did break down, or most of the various type of cars he was driving, at the end of the day there was invariably a good reason for it. It was either a mechanical defect, the part that being manufactured was probably under too much stress. And there's another good point as well, certainly in 1954 when he was driving the 250 Maserati, it wasn't really known as a reliable car. He had quite a lot of teething troubles in his first year.
He was never known as a man who suffered fools gladly. Was he easy to work with?
He wasn't a difficult man to work for. He had his moments. He was a very fair man. He took a positive interest in the preparation of the car. He would take a direct interest in any modifications that were going to be carried out. He would want to know what modifications were being carried out and why. He was quite prepared to discuss the modifications he proposed to carry out in a constructive way, so he couldn't take offence about it.
Was there much change in Stirling's approach from 1954 to 1959 when he finished his works drives with Mercedes, Maserati and Vanwall?
Well, obviously it changed. He's a lot more mature, a terrible lot more experience. Probably the youthfulness had disappeared from him slightly. However, his aptitude, and certainly you're talking about the 59 BRM 2.5 litre, certainly his driver, inside him, the feeling hadn't disappeared. And I remember vividly at Aintree, for the Grand Prix in Aintree 59, where he finished second. I think he qualified around about 6th or 7th on the grid, and his feeling was that he didn't have any chance at all in the particular race. But the record shows that in that particular race he drove a very, very fine race, and he finished second to Jack Brabham.
Moss was the great all-rounder. Where was the edge?
Everywhere. I mean, he wasn't about to tell us, but I would say that the more difficult the conditions, the quicker that Moss would be. Comparatively speaking, the difference in times in wet weather, for instance, were very much more than it would be in dry conditions. It could be maybe a tenth or a quarter of a second on, say, British circuits in dry conditions, and maybe up to a second and a half in wet conditions.
Was it that he was the quickest driver, or was it that he was the quickest driver over a longer period than most?
Well, he was always quick, right up until his accident. He was, I would say, with the exception of Fangio, he was the quickest driver in the world.
Moss tended to take a very analytical approach to his racing. Is natural ability and experience important, or can an analytical approach succeed?
Might do with certain people. I don't think it worked with me. A lot of drivers were very natural drivers. Stirling was one that I would have thought was a very natural driver right from the word go. He was astonishingly quick.
Clark was in a class of his own. To me, Clark was a born driver with enormous natural ability, with very little mechanical knowledge, but because he had Colin Chapman at his elbow, Colin Chapman was clever enough to be able to interpret Jimmy's explanations of what he wanted or what he missed or whatever, and therefore as a team they were a tremendous team. I mean, Jack, I think, could come in and do to the car exactly what he wanted to do, and he'd get the answer he wanted. I mean, Jimmy wouldn't even know as much as me. I mean, at least I could set the dampers on the hood-eye dampers and the tire pressures and all that. And Jimmy, I don't mean Jimmy was stupid. He wasn't, but I mean he just had no mechanical. He didn't need the mechanical knowledge. And I think he was one of the greatest drivers. I really do. I think Fangio is the top, but then I think you've got Jimmy Clark has to be up there with him. Not quite as good, but I think he's up of that style. Although, as I say, he didn't. I was not racing really when he was at his very best, and I had my crash.
With his wide experience in different Grand Prix cars, Stirling has some interesting comparisons between makes.
The Lotus, it was a very rewarding car, but it was not nearly as, didn't give one the feeling of mastery that you get with a Cooper. A Cooper, you go into a corner, you throw the Cooper, and the thing would do this, and you could balance it on the throttle and everything. Fantastic, but you could, with the Lotus, you had to guide it into the corner. You had to say, look, we're going to try this, will you? And it would go a lot. I mean, the Lotus was rather like going out with a sophisticated girl that you didn't know, and the Cooper was a lot more fun, and the Cooper was going out with a girl who was a lot of fun. I was very concerned about the mechanical. You see, there are three reasons for an accident. One is oil on the circuit, which was then, of course, very, very important and very often happened. Another one would be driver failure, which is up to one which you can try and safeguard against that, but that's the second one, or another driver maybe. And the third one, of course, is mechanical failure. And mechanical failure was a concern, very much so, particularly on the Lotus. I mean, when I drove for Merckx, you didn't even think of mechanical failure. Drive for Ferrari didn't even enter my mind. The only mechanical failure, if you're over rev, you might bend something, but I mean mechanical failure of the car, no. Maserati, not often. But Lotus, very much a concern. And when a wheel comes off, and I'd had wheels come off, and then you have to go into a race the following week or two, and drive down, as we did it, I think it was a Porto or somewhere, drive very, very fast down an avenue of trees. That takes quite a lot of courage. That to me was very off-putting, because I would go down there and think, my God, if a wheel came off now, I'm doing 115, 130, whatever it was. If a wheel came off, there are trees as big as this around, and I'm going to hit one. And that's very scary. When you're at a start line, you're sort of looking around like this, you know, if there's no crumpet to look at, and you're sort of looking at the car, and I'm glancing down in the cockpit, and I suddenly see this crack, and I called Alf over. I said, you know, this is in the chassis. Oh, he said, my God, we must weld it. So they took off the things, and they couldn't move the tanks, but he put rags on it and poured water on them. And when he came along with this, it wasn't an electric weld, with a gas torch. I mean, the people who were always crowding around, boy, they didn't half pull back. I'll tell you this, there were a few people pouring the water on, and Alf welded the damn thing on the start line. I mean, fantastic. I mean, that to me is what makes the racing mechanic different from your really good guy on the garage, you know, on the corner. Alf and I had a love-hate relationship where there was an enormous amount of respect, I think, on both sides. I knew that Alf would give me the very best he could, and I think Alf knew that I would, whatever happened, I'd drive it as hard as I could, the best I could. And I would go in and suggest things, and I had a lot of crazy ideas, I'm sure, as did he. I mean, he built cars that didn't succeed. Alf was a mechanic, a really good mechanic. He was not a designer. And this is what happens. It's like secretaries think they should be PAs, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Mechanics who aren't designers. I mean, he just couldn't do things that the designers could do. But then he wasn't brought up with designers the way they are now. We didn't have those people. I mean, John Heath designed the HWM, which meant he took a thing and sort of welded up, took bits off a standard Vanguard and mixed them together with bits off of something else and made a car. They weren't the sort of designers that we have nowadays. So Alf was brought up in a different era, and they were just different people, and he was one of the greatest mechanics in my mind that ever lived of that era. A lower powered car was far less responsive to drive, not as nice to drive, and I think the drivers that were in Formula One obviously had the capability of driving bigger engines, and we felt this was an unrealistic way of trying to bring in safety. I mean, and it was very unpopular. The reason for that, I suppose, is that particularly if you've got very little power, you've got to try to use 100% of it all the time. And the less you get, I think the more opportunity maybe it gives the better driver to demonstrate over a lesser driver, because if a driver goes into a corner and you corner too hard, you scrub off too much, too much speed. And therefore, if you are able to feel the car through the corner a bit faster than another guy without scrubbing it off, obviously it will help. And I was very lucky in as much as that both the races that I happened to win, both Monaco and the Ring, in principle are race circuits where the slower car can be closer to a faster car than on the fast circuits, obviously so. And luckily there were two very important events from my career, really. And I think if there'd been 2.5 litre cars, I would like to hope that I could win, but I don't think that it would have looked quite so good because I was 40 horsepower down on 30% or whatever it was on the Ferrari, and therefore that shined well. But that's another thing of it. It's easier to be the underdog and do well than it is to be the winner and do well, really.
After a decade, Enzo Ferrari and Stirling Moss did get around to discussing racing together.
Ferrari had contacted me, and I've been down to see him. And he said, look, Moss, you tell me what you want and I'll build it for you. You want 6 cylinders, 8 cylinders, you tell me. And I had said to him at the time, I would be happy to drive your car, provided it's painted in Rob Walker blue, and Rob runs it, you maintain it, and we'll run it as a team for you. And he'd agreed. And in fact, the car was built. I never drove it, of course, because I had my accident. But the car was built, did come over here, and I think Innis Island maybe tried it, shakedown test. But that was on the racing car, And also there was talk about having a sports car as well, but I don't think they actually finished building that because it wasn't required at that time.
Stirling's Grand Prix career came to an end in 1962 at the Easter meeting at Goodwood, when he had a serious accident that nearly cost him his life. To this day, he doesn't remember anything.
No, the only things that I can remember literally were probably before the race, leaving where I stayed, where I remember hitting a post that the garage doors closed against, and it was very low, and I was in a Lotus, a rather nice Lotus I had with an automatic gearbox, and I reversed out over this and hit it, and not with terrible results, but I remember hitting it, and I think that was on race day. I think I probably I think I remember going around the paddock with a friend of mine who was a polio victim, but I'm not sure it was that day. And the next thing I remember certainly was it was in hospital quite a few weeks later, sort of becoming to and seeing all the flowers. That was the first thing I remember after the accident. All I can think of is that Graham Hill went like this to acknowledge a signal. I think the flag marshal probably showed him a flag, and I think Graham went like this, and I think it's possible, and this is only to surmise, that I saw him do that and thought, well, he meant, okay, I can pass him, because after all, I was still a long way behind. And Graham had a very funny line. He had this very wide line, so he might have been in and then would swoop out. And Graham was certainly not the person who was a dirty driver. I mean, he wasn't in any way, so he certainly wouldn't have waved me on and then carved me out. So I'm inclined to think that maybe he gave me what I misread to be come on, which was not that. And then he pulled out onto his normal line, and I might have been going past him thinking, my gosh, I better pull over. Pulled over, got onto the grass and may have hit some ruts and gone out of control. I just can't think of anything else, because where I went off, I don't think I would be normally likely to be in trouble unless something untoward happened.
His recovery was very slow.
When I was in hospital all that time, I was convinced that next month I'd be in the next Grand Prix or the next Grand Prix or the next Grand Prix. And then it became obvious that I was a lot more seriously hurt than I had at first believed. And but I still felt that, I'd had accidents technically worse than this. I broke my back and my legs, which was really quite a bad chance at that spar when the wheel came off. And so I felt that I ought to be able to do it. And I went to Goodwood, and when I got in the car, I was very disappointed at my lack of normal reactions. I don't think my reaction times were slow, but I mean everything that I had to do was a conscious effort. And whereas normally I would have just backed off here and pulled in there and done this and so on, so I had to think about, my gosh, I would be doing this by now or that, and it became very, very obvious to me that I was not adequate to continue as I had done before. And there's no two ways about it in my mind now. That I should not have got to try myself out for another year or two. I think I should have gone back to give myself a test once I got my concentration back. And to get my concentration back took many months, maybe a year and a bit, before it came back, because at that time I could start telling you about something and my mind would wander to something else and I'd forget why I told you this way. Or if I gave you an analogy for something, I forget why the hell I was telling you the analogy, those sort of things. And I hadn't realized how much of my mental makeup that affected, or how much of my capabilities of driving, I suppose, and therefore it did come back, and I obviously got better later, but I think that by then probably it would have been too late anyway, because the whole structure of the sport had changed. They'd gone on to slicks. I'd never raced on slicks. Slicks came in, and I think really maybe I might have got in just before slicks. And I think if I'd managed to go then I think probably I could have caught up. I couldn't make that big gap.
Since then, Stirling has made a career of being Stirling Moss, with public appearances and competition in classic and historic events.
Obviously one can't go back to as things were when you're racing every week in cars that were at the time highly competitive. It's different. Historic racing I enjoy. I enjoy historic racing for the people and for the fact that one has a little bit of a sprint, if you like. But it can't obviously compare with a 500-kilometer Formula One race of 1956. My main business, I suppose, is in two things. One side is property, where I have bought houses and converted them to flats, and that's nothing to do with racing at all. It's something that I did, and it's something you go into a game with no backing, if you like, with no experience, I mean. The other half is public relations, flogging a fading image, trying to keep my name known, trying to be available and to do things and so on. And so I do quite a lot of appearances, opening garages or giving talks or lectures or whatever, or writing stories or whatever. And that is really, I suppose, half of my livelihood comes from that.
Stirling was knighted in 1999 at the age of 70 for his services to motorsport. The record might show that Sir Stirling Moss was runner-up 4 times in the World Championship. However, he's been an unquestioned winner for over 50 years with the public, who appreciate his press-on driving style and his lively personality.